So I'm going to start the next session. The next session is called the Colonial Constitution. Arghya Sengupta discusses his new examination of constitutional history in conversation with Monideepa Banerjie. While I'm introducing the two panelists on stage, would request them to just come in front. So I'm going to start with Arghya Sengupta, who is the founder and research director at Vidhi. His areas of specialization are constitutional law and regulation of the digital economy. He has served on a number of government committees, including a committee of experts on data protection framework for India. He has, to his credit, a number of academic publications on the Supreme Court and the Constitution in leading law journals such as Law Quarterly Review and Public Law. He is also a columnist at the Telegraph and the Times of India. Welcome. If you could have a round of applause for him, please. And introducing Monideepa Banerjie, who is a Kolkata-based journalist reporting on contemporary politics in West Bengal. She is, in fact, the most familiar face of Kolkata on national TV, having covered everything east for India's premier news channel NDTV for the last 28 years. She began her career with the Telegraph, was one of the earliest journalists in the country to transition to television, and is a Chevening Scholar and a Fulbright Fellow. She remains a news hound today, working independently across platforms and watching the media in India march to drum beats that have certainly changed since she joined the profession 40 years ago. Welcome, both of you, and I'll open the panel off to you. Before we start the session, would like to inform you that Kamal sir's books are available at the Story Bookstore up ahead. Thank you.
Thank you. I heard most of the previous discussion. Were you all there? All of you were here for the last discussion? Well, it was such an emotional and uplifting, really, session. But here and now, from the emotional, we are going to make a huge jump to the constitutional, which is very, very different. And happy Republic Day, everybody. And exactly 75 years ago, this day, we adopted the Constitution. That's served us well, I think, for the last 75 years. This is a wonderful venue. And interestingly, we have this beautiful monument behind us, which is a colonial monument, right? And Kolkata is ever so proud of it. Think about it, we are actually speaking in the colonial language. And yet, Arghya Sengupta here, he has written this book which says, the Constitution is colonial. A colonial constitution, Arghya? I think you'd better fill us up on why you think so.
Yeah, so first of all, thanks very much. It's a real fanboy moment for me to be sitting here with you, someone who I've seen on TV saying, and this is Monideepa Banerjie for NDTV from Kolkata for many, many years. So a big round of applause.
Endlessly.
Yeah, no,
Thank you.
So this is what news used to be at one point of time when we all used to watch it. But it's great to have Monideepa Di here and to have a conversation with her. And I think the Victoria Memorial is actually a great place to have this discussion, because what I think it is that it is a colonial monument which is dedicated to Queen Victoria, but it is also very clearly in the Indo-Saracenic style. So it's not in a post-revival Gothic style, it's in an Indo-Saracenic style. So it's kind of got an underlying foundation of colonial rule, but is Indian in its execution, and it's now been fully appropriated. And I think that's a good metaphor for what the Constitution is as well.
Absolutely.
The fact is, and this is a factual matter and something that we don't need to shy away from, it's a fact that the Constitution does perpetuate colonial institutions like the police force, the Indian Administrative Service. It has several colonial ideas of law and order, and it also is greatly derived from the Government of India Act. And I'll give you one simple example, and I think that will set us going. if you look at the notifications that were issued on the 26th of January 1950, the first 4 notifications was very interesting. First is Rajagopal Achari, who's the Governor General, first proclaims India as a constitutional republic and that the constitution comes into force. Number 1. Number 2 is Rajendra Prasad is appointed president. Number 3, his appointment is communicated to all states and various offices. And number 4, which is where it gets really interesting, is that the preventive detention order is extended for a period of 3 months. It's in that order. India becomes a constitutional republic, Rajendra Prasad becomes president, and at the same time, we continue to keep in prison certain people who have remained there. And I think that shows you as to how much law and order, integrity, unity, which were all kind of facets of the colonial state, continue to play a role in the new constitutional order as well.
Tell us a little bit more about preventive detention. I mean, what did the British do with it and what have we done with it? Has it been useful to us or has it been misused?
So, preventive detention, the best way of understanding it is through the Rowlatt Act. We all remember the Rowlatt Act, which Gandhiji had called a black act. He had said that no civilized country would ever accept it. What preventive detention allowed the British police, the Imperial Police Service to do is essentially come to someone, pick them up and put them in lockup without any legal process whatsoever. They would have to be produced before a magistrate later. So this is what Bush and Blair called a preemptive strike in some sense, that you first apprehend and then you start the legal process.
For example, who? Can you give me some names that we all might know?
Well, during the British Raj, as in during the Rowlatt Act, as in Gandhiji himself was imprisoned under preventive detention, Nehru was imprisoned, Patel was imprisoned during the Bardoli Satyagraha under preventive detention. All these people were
after independence.
Yeah, so this is actually where it gets very interesting. So first, the preventive detention order gets extended, and what happens then is that several state governments pass these legislations which are now called Gundas Acts,
Correct.
which allow policemen to essentially come to your house, pick you up, and put you in lockup. It may be for a few days. And here, the names are actually not well known. And why is that? Because in post-independence India, this provision, which was used against freedom fighters, is now used against the poor, the marginalized, and those who cannot get access to legal assistance. So just to give you a statistic, in 2021 in India, a total of 58 lakh people were arrested of crimes. That is, they've committed some crime and FIR was filed and they were arrested. Some process was followed. In comparison, about 87.6 lakh people were detained. And this is essentially, it won't happen to you or me. It's unlikely that it will happen to you or me. But this is essentially police power, because this is something that the Constitution and the framers of the Constitution in their wisdom felt that they needed at that point of time. They wanted law and order, so they gave police a huge amount of powers. But now most of these powers, I'm sorry to say, are misused.
There is another particular segment in the Constitution which was there in the British version and then disappeared for 2 years and then came back in the Indian version of the Constitution, and that is sedition. And that is something we all know, and people who get arrested under it often become famous, unlike people under preventive detention. So how has sedition journeyed from a colonial constitution to the post-colonial constitution and in its latest version in the new law, whatever IPCs that have been framed?
No, so we were in the Bengal Club before this, which of course was the home of Macaulay, and Macaulay had a statement that it will be the proudest day of English rule when Indians decide to have English institutions and English laws for themselves. And I think, contrary to what the Home Minister said on the floor of the House when he was introducing the 3 legislations to replace the IPC, CRPC and the Evidence Act, the fact is that these 3 legislations are essentially at core colonial laws. Because
Again.
And you see what the ironic bit is that the impulse behind these legislations is a very sound one. The impulse is that the British with the IPC and and the Evidence Act essentially wanted to imprison Indians. Because the Evidence Act, particularly if you look at it, is based on the premise that all Indians are liars. Natives are liars, so you must have complicated rules of evidence to ensure that the truth is filtered out. Now, the impulse to change this legislation, is it a reasonable one? It is a reasonable one. I think there's nothing wrong with that
Fair
impulse
enough,
to
yeah.
want to change that. But what do you do with it? What you do with it essentially is, number one, what has been done is that 80% of those examples of what I've just mentioned are replicated in the new statute. There are no changes. Two, you've changed the names and you've given them names which sound more Indic. Three, it actually becomes more colonial than the colonial rulers, because if you were to take a simple example, the death penalty. The death penalty was
back
in
with
the
the force.
IPC in 11 offenses. So for 11 offenses, you could get the death penalty. Under the new Sanhita, there are 15 offenses under which you can get the death penalty. So this is really not treating the natives any differently. It is still very much a heavy-handed law and order approach. And this is what has happened to sedition as well. Sedition has gone away in name, but the fact is the number of the section has changed, but it has come in a different form, in a different avatar. So sedition hasn't gone. And for this, it's not as if it's this government that is responsible. And I think we should be clear about this, that as far as issues of sedition are concerned, this is an issue of the citizen vis-a-vis the state, as opposed to this government or that. No government in independent India has even made any effort to remove sedition. As we remember, during the time of the previous UPA government, sedition was used against a cartoonist, Asim Trivedi, who had drawn the parliament as a commode. And sedition was used here against Ambikesh Mohapatra for a cartoon. So, it's a question of governmental power and unaccountable governmental power.
Before we lose interest of the audience over here, let me bring you closer home. Okay, sedition, apparently, there's a little sidelight that I learned, that the first time that sedition was ever used in this country was in Kolkata, back in 1890, against the editor of Bongo Bashi. But the charge was ultimately dropped. But never mind that. What I want to bring closer back home is this audience must be familiar with two things that I am. One is, ever since I started this business of journalism, I have been dealing with state governments that are forever complaining about center-state relations. I mean, Jyoti Basu really made a case out of that, and now we have Ms. Monideepa Banerjie, our Chief Minister, also making a case that the center has all the power, we don't, and the center has all the money, and we don't, and they don't give us our money. This is also constitution, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think a little bit of tension between the center and the states is a good thing. I think we actually don't want a one-party state in the country. We had that during the Congress rule. And I think that actually doesn't create a system of checks and balances. But I think if we were to look at the Constitution, I think we must be clear on one thing, that it is a very center-heavy constitution. That is the drift of the constitution. Again, if we look at the recent judgment of the Supreme Court in the Article 370 case. Now, Article 370 is, of course, a particular example, and I don't want to get into that example. But one of the fundamental basis for the Supreme Court upholding the abrogation of Article 370 of the Constitution is that the court says that the purpose of the Constitution's federal framework is enhanced integration. Now, that is the underlying basis of the constitutional framework. And on that, the court is right, because what the framers of the Constitution thought, in their wisdom, is that we have just had the history of partition. We now need unity. The way to achieve unity is through a strong center. So the cabinet mission plan is gone, it's thrown into the dustbin. The Constituent Assembly has now been divided. The members who are belonging to the areas that are now Pakistan have gone. And so now you've created a very strong center, because you feel that that is the way to ensure unity in the nation. And that is what is causing kind of this judgment by Chief Justice Chandrachud, that the entire drift of the constitution is towards enhanced integration. Now, I think that there is where 75 years down, and as you said, today is exactly 75 years. So 75 years down, I think we have to rethink this. I feel today that if there is a genuine fear of disintegration, that will happen if there is too much unification and too strong a center that is imposing its writ everywhere in the country without any check or balance. I think now the tables have turned. So if we have a center which says that, we can't have this conversation in English, we must have this conversation in Hindi.
We are dead.
That's the kind of that, and I have nothing against having this conversation in Hindi. It would be a very bad conversation because my Hindi is pretty poor. But having lived in Delhi for 10 years, maybe it's a little better than Monideepa Di's.
Yes, it is.
But having said that, I think that that's the kind of threat to the unity and integrity of India that exists today. And that will not happen by a center that's too strong. That will happen only if there's a center that's kind of more balanced.
The other thing that Kolkata and Bengal would, associate very easily with is the powers of, you talked about preventive detention. What we see a lot of over here is ED and CBI. It's like the ED and CBI regime, and they are forever in Kolkata, and the government is agitated about it. What are the constitutional provisions that created this, and is the implementation ethical? What's happening over here?
No, so firstly, as in the ED and CBI are not creatures of the constitution, as in they are creatures of law. As in the CBI used to be what is called the Delhi Special Police Establishment, which was set up in 1946. It operates because there was mutual bonhomie between center and state. So the state said that there could be certain cases which are national. We had the Mundra scandal at that point of time, an early case. And there were several cases which were kind of national in character. So it needed a kind of national investigative agency in order to do that. The ED, of course, is a much more recent invention. It came under the Prevention of Money Laundering Act recently. So one, as a factual matter, as in the Constitution, has little to do with it. But in the larger scheme of things, what I think the wanton misuse of the CBI and the ED by this government and previous governments before it have shown is that that we live, and I want to make this very simple and clear, that we live in what is a police state. And that is a police state that we have to admit is sanctioned by the Constitution. Now, the framers of the Constitution felt, and they felt with all good intention, that now that the government is run by Indians and the police force is going to be run by Indians alone, it will be run in the best interest of Indians. And in the heady atmosphere of 1947 to 50, it's a perfectly reasonable view to hold that this might happen. But the fact is that an H.V. Kamath, who was a close associate of Netaji, and he was the General Secretary of the Forward Bloc, called the day that we had the provision relating to police powers and emergency powers, called it the darkest day in India's constitutional history. Another member said that this is going to be used against political opponents and political opponents alone. So it was very clear to the framers of the Constitution that they were letting loose what was essentially a kind of loose cannon. And I think in that sense, the chickens have come home to roost. So what you see today is essentially a breakdown of our, you use the word ethics, and I think it's essentially that's what it is. I mean, it's a breakdown of morality in politics.
But I just want to come back to your book specifically. And, one of the things that he says in the book is that it's based, the whole Constitution, or 1/3 of the Constitution, is based on the Government of India Act of 1939. And elements of the British, Act have been put in over here, which is why it is colonial, right?
Yeah, so I offer three reasons as to why it's colonial. I think the first is that is the fact that it perpetuates colonial institutions. And let me be clear in saying this beforehand, that just because something is colonial doesn't mean that I'm saying it should be trashed, right? I'm not saying that, and I said this very clearly in my book, that this is not to say that we should write a new constitution today. This is to recognize the origin story of this constitution. And so I think that bit must be made very clear right at the outset. But there are three reasons as to why it's colonial. First, as I said, is that it perpetuates colonial institutions. Why didn't we think about community policing? Why didn't we think about local self-government? We thought about the Indian civil service. That's the Imperial Civil Service, which becomes the Indian Civil Service, the Imperial Police Service, which becomes the Indian Police Service. So we perpetuated colonial institutions in the hope that they would reform themselves. They haven't, and that's why this colonial constitution perpetuates. The second reason is that I've said this is colonial because there is a towering state that is really sort of sitting above us all as citizens. And here, I mean, the moment where I thought that I needed to write this book was during COVID. And there was a scene which many of you would have seen in the newspapers during the first wave. This is when migrant labor were walking back to their villages. And there was a scene outside Bareilly where there were 50 migrant laborers who were crouched like this on the side of the road, and they were being sprayed by with chemical disinfectant. And that, for me, signified what the colonial state was about. That even 75 years down, the state is towering above with a chemical spray, and the citizens are below on their haunches waiting for the benefaction of the state. And I think that that's the kind of state, the Mai Baap Sarkar, that we are all complicit in creating. And I think that's the second reason as to why it's colonial. And the third, as you've mentioned yourself, is the fact that 1/3 of it is based on the Government of India Act, which makes it a very long constitution. As I have some friends here who were with me in school, and you all remember in school we were told that India has the longest constitution in the world. And I didn't know whether to feel happy or sad at that. It meant that we had more articles of the constitution to mug up. But there was a reason as to why the constitution is so long. And the reason is that the framers of the constitution felt that India is not yet ready for democracy. So we must put everything into the constitution. So an example that I use in my book, which is relevant to Bengal, is that there's a provision called Article 273, which deals with jute. Now, the provision goes into an excruciating amount of detail to say, and I'm cutting this short to put it simply, that when jute is exported by the government of India, the customs duty that the government gets on jute will be shared as grants in aid with the states of West Bengal, Odisha and Bihar, which are the major producers of jute. Now, I can understand the importance of jute to the local economy here. But is it important enough to put in the constitution? Why did we think that we had to put an article like this in the constitution? And the reason is that the framers felt that they couldn't trust the elected representatives in Delhi and Bengal, Bihar and Odisha to work this out. Because if we could trust them, they would have worked out something that would have worked for them. So the reason why it's long is because there is a holdover of a colonial construct that the natives can't be trusted. We can't say natives, so we say that India is not ready for democracy. So I think these are the reasons why I think the constitution is a colonial one, though not entirely a bad one.
Okay. If you had been in the Constituent Assembly, everything has to be put in a context of a time. It was a very different time then, very turbulent, tumultuous, and the Constituent Assembly did what they possibly thought was the best. If you had been in the Constituent Assembly, what are two things that you would have done completely differently?
Yeah, so I think there was an alternative to the constitution that we had, which we needed to think about much more seriously. And that alternative was presented by Mahatma Gandhi. I think even today, I find Gandhi's absence from the political discourse fairly conspicuous, which allows him to be appropriated by a range of people who absolutely had nothing to do with Gandhi during his lifetime. Now, the reason I say this is that there are twofold. One is that the Gandhian idea of the constitution was a bottom-up constitution. Right? It was a constitution that required panchayats, municipal corporations to be powerful, to have a say over the lives of citizens. Now, we don't need to go into the text of what Gandhi said, because there are kind of extreme elements. But if we take the drift of what he was saying, and this is an idea that certainly if I were ever to think about this issue in a way that it would matter, would perhaps think of doing, is that how can we decentralize power and bring it closer to the people? I think this is what would make sense in this day and age. India is a country which is the size of a continent. We have got more people than Europe and the USA put together. West Bengal is a state which is the size of a country. I mean, Calcutta is a city which is the size of a state anywhere else in the world. So we need to think about how we can devolve powers closer to the people. And I think this is something that we need to, urgently do, not only as an antidote to too much unification, but also to wrest control over our own lives.
But is that practical?
Yeah, I think it is. There's a kind of view that we all feel that it's impractical. This is an instinct that I would much rather have an unnamed bureaucrat in the municipal corporation deciding whether the footpath outside my house should be paved or not, or rather than give it to a local residents' welfare association. And I can see where that comes from. But the fact is that what the 14th Finance Commission did was essentially ensure that there was greater devolution of finances from the center to the states. So from 32%, the amount of money that was made available to the state governments was 42%. And the idea was that that would also be shared with the third tier, that is the local self-governments in villages.
Right.
And that has not happened. But is it practical? It's absolutely practical to give financial powers or limited financial powers with checks and balances to the third tier, and B, limited legislative powers. Why should local hospitals, local schools, and local roads be decided by powers, say, in Bagdogra? Why should it be decided by powers in Calcutta? Or why
It will
should
become
roads...
very random, and people will do whatever they like.
Yeah, I think that might happen, but this kind of scaremongering I don't buy. Because yes, there will be any kind of change, there will be a certain degree of problem. But it's not as if the roads in Calcutta are great anyway. Right? It's not as if it's, whatever, every time I come in, there's another
traffic control is better than
plastering.
Delhi. Traffic is run better than Delhi.
Yeah, no, that's true. I mean, we can, but the fact is that I feel that as someone who's born and brought up in Calcutta, that I feel that there is too much of Delhi in everybody's life, and I think that we need to think about more. And if India has to grow, as in India will not grow with a domineering central government. It certainly needs a central government that can coordinate, but it needs empowered state and local governments. And I think this is an idea that needs to be thought through quite a bit. And second, I think the elephant in the room at this point of time, whether we like it or not, is decolonization. Right? This is what the government has been saying across the board, whether it is in changing the name of Aurangzeb Road to APJ Abdul Kalam Marg, or in renaming the IPC and changing the IPC and calling it the Bharatiya Nyaya Sanhita. This is the kind of phase one of decolonization, which is its symbols and names and so on. But what I am interested in is that can decolonization actually mean something that is meaningful? And for me, that would be citizens wresting control of their lives from the state, which would mean greater rights for citizens, reduced powers, particularly of the police state, and greater checks and balances. Now, this will not happen overnight. I'm not suggesting, this book is not a suggestion of reform. I'm not saying that we need a new constitution with ABC tomorrow, which will change it. But the idea behind the book is that each of you present here, many of you may be lawyers and from the legal fraternity, but most of you, I think, will not be. I think each of you needs to have a view on the Constitution. This is why I put the Union Jack on the cover of the Constitution, to provoke you. It's controversial. Well, my publishers did that, but it's essentially to provoke you to having a view. You can agree with it or disagree with it. But one thing that bothers me the most, and I think this is a refrain that I hear across the board, is that the Constitution is a holy book. And you find that people in the political establishment say it, as in people who are virulently opposed to the political establishment also say it. But whenever something becomes a holy book, I worry. because I feel that then it's a document that you will no longer engage with, but it's rather something that you will venerate. I think the Constitution needs to be constructively engaged with. It needs to be critiqued, because if we don't do it, then we'll go the way of the IPC, which is that before you know it, there will be a new one.
You know, he was talking about decolonization, and I was just thinking, oh my God, are we going to end up renaming Victoria Memorial because of decolonization? It could happen, who knows? But anyway, to get to the other point that I wanted to make, you mentioned the Gandhi Constitution. There's another constitution that perhaps you should talk about, and that is Veer Savarkar's constitution. I mean, I know so little about it. How many of you know that Veer Savarkar wrote an Indian constitution? You know about it, right? Okay, so that's one person out of so many. So you know that it's not very well known.
Yeah, and I think it should be better known, because I think Vikram Sampath has done a great job in writing the book on Savarkar, because there's no point in sidelining somebody who's played a significant role in the freedom movement. And I think we need to know him and we need to understand him properly. And you can agree with him or disagree with him, but you need to know him. And I think the interesting thing about the Constitution of the Hindustan Free State, which was the constitution that was drafted and endorsed by the Hindu Mahasabha when Savarkar was president. There are 3 interesting articles in that constitution. The first interesting article was that it said that there shall be no state religion in India, and India shall be a secular state. Now, one is that we must know this because the idea of a constitutional Hindu Rashtra, which is kind of something that I get as a question that, are you asking for a Hindu Rashtra? The idea of a constitutional Hindu Rashtra was foreclosed by Savarkar's constitution. It was now, there were many reasons for it, and we can get into that, but I think a fact is a fact, and a fact has to be mentioned as sacred. And I think what would have been interesting, and I was thinking about it, is that if that provision were there in the constitution today, maybe the Prime Minister could not consecrate a temple. Someone at least would have filed, because I was quite actually interested by this, because there are always petitioners who go to the Supreme Court with a PIL on any subject. But there was no PIL filed on this. There was something in Allahabad High Court saying why wasn't a Shankaracharya invited, but there was no PIL filed on this, and with a good reason. There is nothing in the Constitution of India today to stop the Prime Minister of India consecrating a temple. And I think we should be clear. We should be clear that there is nothing unconstitutional about the Prime Minister doing it. Now, you can say that, he should not do it as a matter of politics. You don't disagree with the politics. That's a different issue. But I'm only on the point of the Constitution itself. But if there was Savarkar's Constitution, and this is where things become complex and ambiguous, maybe things would have been a little bit different. That's number one. Number 2 is that they said that the Constitution of the Hindustan Free State said that no law shall discriminate between persons of different religions. So there was no question.
That is which one? Our Constitution?
No, the Constitution of the Hindustan Free State. We have a similar provision in our Constitution. So essentially you can't discriminate between citizen and citizen. And third is that there will be rights for minorities to preserve culture, language, and script, which is the same provision that exists in the Constitution of India. So you see that in the overall framework of the Constitution of the Hindustan Free State, in many ways, is similar to the Constitution of India. And I think this is an important point to keep in mind. This is not to say that if there were a constitution today, the constitution would mimic that of the Constitution of the Hindustan Free State, but this is the only constitution drafted by a party belonging to the Sangh Parivar, and I think it's important that that fact is put out there.
So you're saying that in our constitution, as it exists today, there is nothing that prevents the Prime Minister playing priest at a temple?
Nothing in the text of the constitution, no.
But aren't we secular?
See, that's the point. We are a secular country, but the question always is that what does secularism mean? And I've written an article in the Times of India today itself, which is that we have not taken this version of secularism, which is the separation of the church and the state, the French understanding of laïcité. We don't have that understanding of secularism. So we have always adopted an understanding of secularism of sarva dharma samabhav, which is equal respect for all religions. So there are 2 things here. One, the version of secularism that we have adopted is a version that there is no discrimination between religions.
Correct.
Can the Prime Minister of India go as a practice? Can he be a practicing Hindu? Sure, he can. Can he go to a temple and perform a ceremony? Sure, he can. But by the same token, as I've said in the article, that a girl in Karnataka who wants to wear a hijab in her classroom should be allowed to wear a hijab in her classroom, because you can't have it one way and not the other. And I think
that's
so. So I would say that the hijab ban, the judgment of the Karnataka High Court that has banned the hijab in classrooms, that is unconstitutional. I think that judgment is wrong. That is a wrong reading of the Constitution. I think just as the Constitution allows the Prime Minister to consecrate and do the Pran Pratishtha at Ayodhya, the Constitution also allows Tabassum Sheikh to wear her hijab in her classroom in Bangalore.
Okay. I can't let you go without making this one point. Just months ago, we had Bibek Debroy, who is the chairman of the Prime Minister's Economic Affairs Council, Advisory Council. He wrote an article in which he suggested that it's time to change the constitution. It created a lot of chatter, and a lot of people felt that Bibek Debroy was plugging a line which was not a good idea, and that it was an idea that the BJP party would like to push. And then we have his book, which says Colonial Constitution. What's happening? There are many people who say that your book could be a part of a design to promote and provoke a debate on it. So
yeah,
there is a change.
Yeah, I think the people who say that haven't read the book. I think so. First, I think the copies are available. So if you want to buy it, please do, and then I'll be very happy to have a discussion on it. But I think the answer to this question lies elsewhere. I think the Constitution over time has become a symbol that people can hold on to protect some values that they think are critical in the country. And my point is that the Constitution does have some of those values. It doesn't have all of those values. So if I were to just read a very short excerpt, which I think would summarize my view on the Constitution quite well, and I think would be an answer of the kind that hopefully will satisfy some of the critics. We live in polarized time, and any constitution that emerges out of such a time is unlikely to be long-lasting. But my book is a call to think more deeply about the Constitution rather than merely extolling its virtues in a rhetorical fashion or criticizing it unthinkingly. The Constitution creates a towering state that stifles individual initiative. It creates big governments that diminish the role of local communities. It gives citizens fundamental rights but hedges them with a slew of restrictions. At the same time, it spells out a vision of a more equal, secular, democratic India with free and fair elections based on universal adult franchise. If India is to prosper, it needs to embrace some of what the Constitution has to offer: the promise of freedom, communal harmony, and equality. Equally, it has to reject some other bits: preventive detention, rights without meaningful duties, a colonial state which over time has become a rent-seeking one. So I think my view is that things are usually not simple black and white. The fact is that we, as an academic, I feel that we always need to debate new constitutional ideals, because otherwise it will just spring up on us in ways that we can never imagine. So certainly I agree with some parts of what Bibek Debroy has said. There are parts of the Constitution that does require rewriting. But does it mean that we do a wholesale rewriting and we need a new Constitution? Maybe not. So ultimately, each of us has to have a considered view on the Constitution, what works and what doesn't. And if we do that, then I think the country will be in a better place than it is today.
Great place to break off and allow the audience to raise some questions if they have some. I have plenty more, so yes, ma'am.
Hello. Yeah, question for Arghya. What can you as a citizen do if you find something that's being done to you that is unconstitutional? I'll give you a very wild example from Lakshadweep, very much in the news. But if you were a citizen of Lakshadweep Union Territory, you find that suddenly beef was being banned, suddenly your university, your colleges were being shifted from Kerala University, because the medium is Malayalam, to Pondicherry University, and you always had cultural prohibition. Your administrator from Gujarat is now trying to remove prohibition from the state. What can I, as a hypothetical citizen of Lakshadweep, do?
So actually, this is a throwback to the past because usually you were the one who were answering all the questions at the quizzes that I attended and not asking them.
You know, we never asked who you were. She didn't introduce herself.
But she doesn't need to.
I'm Jayashree Mohanka, and I've seen him as a little boy quizzer from St. Xavier's from childhood. Lovely to see where you ended up. Thank you.
Thank you very much, ma'am. And so I think when Gandhi has a nice quote, which is that it's not constitutions that make nations, but nations that make constitutions. And I think the ultimate answer to what a citizen can do, it lies in the politics of that state and that place. I mean, I would love to say that, yes, you can file a petition, a writ petition in the Supreme Court if your fundamental right has been violated. If you were, say, trading in buffalo meat or in beef and your right has been violated, you could file a petition in the Supreme Court. That is, of course, a short-term solution because I feel that may not be the answer that you're looking for. But ultimately, the answer lies in the political establishment and the political opposition that exists in that particular state. Because I feel that in any democracy, as unsatisfying and theoretical as this answer might be, if you don't like a government that has imposed a beef ban, then you have to essentially ensure that you don't vote for that government. And ultimately, that's really the answer. There are short-term solutions like going to the court, but they're not going to give a lasting remedy.
Yeah, but a union territory has no government. It's entirely central.
No, so the government, as in the union territory government of Lakshadweep, for example, I mean, is a government that is run by the UT administration, which the cadre is a central cadre, but they would have passed a notification. So that notification essentially is something that can be challenged, number one. Number two is that Lakshadweep has one member of parliament. I mean, that also, right. that person has been, I mean, is in the throes of getting imprisoned and so on, as in there's a case ongoing with that. But ultimately, as in it's in ensuring that we have a better politics in the country that will ensure that the citizen of Lakshadweep will find some succor. But this is something that is going to take a lot of time.
Lovely. May I take the gentleman over there first? Yes, sir. And please introduce yourself. Can't hear you. Yeah, you have another mic.
Arghya, myself, Monideepa Sengupta. Arghya, I was just waiting to ask you this question for many years, even before knowing that one day you will write this book.
Many years?
Yes.
This is
many
also
years.
somebody you know from your childhood?
No. We are only accidentally Senguptas. We don't have any connections.
Okay.
My question is, we got our constitution on 26th of January 1950. A group of people who framed it, they were not democratically elected because the first election came in 1952. My question is how ironical it is the biggest democracy of the world, India, has a constitution which is framed by a group of people who are not democratically elected. Please your remark.
Please explain. They were elected, right?
No, they were not elected.
No, he's
1947 cabinet of Nehru was not elected, it was selected.
Sure.
It was selected.
Yeah, no, so he's right on that. So basically how the Constituent Assembly was formed is that because the Constituent Assembly came through the Cabinet Mission. The Cabinet Mission recommended a Constituent Assembly. They said it's impractical to hold elections. So what they decided to do was that they were indirectly elected by the members of the various legislative assemblies that existed in state. So they're not elected. He's right on that, but they're like the Rajya Sabha.
They are like the Rajya Sabha.
They are like the Rajya
Like,
Sabha.
the governor would be unelected.
Yes.
But they were elected as in the Rajya Sabha route.
Yeah, they were elected like it was like the Rajya Sabha. So and essentially, as in it was quite interesting how that happened because that process was entirely driven by the Congress party.
Of course.
And that because the Congress party was in power in most of the states and the Muslim League had gone. So there's an interesting story before I come to the substance of this is how did Ambedkar get into the Constituent Assembly? So Ambedkar first contested this because there were elections within the Legislative Assembly. So from Bombay, he tried to get nominated for a seat.
Came from East Bengal,
Yeah,
if
so
I'm not mistaken.
first he tried to get nominated from Bombay. He lost. He couldn't get nominated. Then Jogendranath Mondal, who was
Correct.
a leader from East Bengal, he gave up his seat for Ambedkar.
Which was
but
the seat?
Mondal,
That was East.
but Mondol's seat actually went to East
Correct,
Pakistan.
correct,
So he had to give up that seat again. And then Gandhi intervened and he told Patel to write to BG Kher, who was the premier of Bombay, and to get Ambedkar a nominated seat. So the general drift of what the gentleman is saying is right. That they were not directly elected through franchise. And the fact is that with any constitution, the constitutions are usually created in two kinds of situations. One is the situation of a revolution. So like the French constitution, which happens at the moment, where as it's directly a constitution that is by the people. But in constitutions like the Indian one, which have kind of been in the works for a long period of time, typically speaking, constitution making is done by a technocratic elite, because it's not even the Constituent Assembly. It's actually a smaller committee inside the Constituent Assembly, which is the drafter. So yes, there is a certain degree of irony here that it is done by an indirectly elected body.
Correct.
And I think that we should recognize that, while also recognizing the fact that this is a constitution that had a huge consultative process all across the country, so to ensure that there was quite a bit of direct participation.
Correct, correct. Great, thank you. Thank you. Right, ma'am, you have... Yes, no, I didn't say last. We can
It's
take some more
not
questions.
about the constitution, it's about your book, Arghya. Hello. And you have written the book in a very common language. Being a doctor, I never used to read about the
Law.
constitution and the law.
Yes, you know what I told him?
And-
I said it reads like a PG Woodhouse.
Exactly.
So easy
and
to read.
Thank you very much. And we need some more books like these in the common language, especially about the medico-legal hassles, where we are framed up and we don't know where to go, how to talk, how to solve the problem. So thank you very much to write in a common language. Thank
Lovely.
you.
Thank you very much.
All right. Man, does somebody else have a question? Sure. And I have no idea how we are doing for time.
In
Yes,
the
sir.
Article 370 judgment, there is a portion that has been told that central government has the right to declare any part of any state as union territory without consultation.
Is that so?
Yes.
Yeah. No, so he's paraphrased it essentially, but that is the upshot of this judgment, and that
Yes.
is the worrying upshot of
That
this
is
judgment.
where you're talking about decentralization.
Correct.
In the way it is said, only strengthened centralization.
Yeah, so I think
And
that,
I hope you talk about that another article, famous article of Indian Constitution, that is 356.
yeah, so that is a full chapter of my book, talks about 356.
Correct.
But on 370, and I think this is a very important point, is that while we may think that Article 370 has relevance only for Kashmir, the fact is that the judgment of the Supreme Court deals with the power of President's rule under Article 356, because ultimately, irrespective of whether we politically agree or disagree with what has happened with Article 370, the fact is that it was only made possible because there was President's rule in the state, so there was no elected legislature in Jammu and Kashmir. And what the Supreme Court has said, and very worryingly so, is that the powers of the president under president's rule extend to all or any functions of the state government, which include, as the gentleman said, changing the borders of the state, declaring the state a union territory, dividing it into two states, changing the name of the state. All they have to do is that they have to take the views of the state legislature, which doesn't exist because it's president's rule. So essentially, they can do it themselves. So this is a troubling thought. We are sitting here in Calcutta, that can the center declare president's rule here today and declare Gorkhaland a separate state tomorrow? According to the Supreme Court, it can. And I think the question is not about whether Gorkhaland should be a separate state or not. I'm not competent to talk about the issue. But the question is that this is something that, one, we need to, as citizens, question. And this is something that we need to find a better balance in the Constitution in the way in which our federal setup is designed. Because I find it incredible that a central government can even constitutionally think of having the powers of dividing a state like Bengal into two, or any state for that matter. So my sense is that there is a lot of work to be done, and it can only be done if we stop having blind faith or extolling virtues of anything unthinkingly, but rather have a view on things for ourselves.
Any more questions? Yes, ma'am. I don't know how we are doing for time. We should cut it? Okay. Ma'am, okay? Okay, because that gives me a great exit line, and I have to quote Fali Nariman on this, that the Constitution is great, and we don't need to change the Constitution. What we need to change or do better is the kind of government that's, using it to push its agenda forward. So it's not that the Constitution is all flawed because it's colonial, but would you agree, last question, because I'm the moderator, would you agree that it also is important who is interpreting it to run the country?
Yeah, I think it's absolutely critical that we all go out to vote. And I would say, particularly vote, we will all go out to vote, I'm sure, in West Bengal for our for the elections to Parliament in May. We will certainly all vote for the Legislative Assembly elections, but it's also important to vote for all local elections as well, because ultimately the Constitution is operated by each one of these various representatives. So I think I agree with Mr. Nariman. Who am I to disagree with him? The fact is that there is, as I said, some parts of the Constitution that we need to rethink, but more importantly, the answer to our constitutional malaise lies not in the Constitution itself, but lies in our politics.
Thank you. Perfect line to end this on this lovely afternoon on Republic Day. We should definitely be celebrating what we have, but there's nothing wrong with aiming for better, I guess. Congratulations on your book. I agree with the lady. It brings the Constitution to the ordinary folk. I was very worried that this would be like reams of legal matter, but it's, like I said, easy to read, like a P.G. Woodhouse. Thank you so much, Arghya, and that was a lovely session. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Arghya sir and Monideepa ma'am, for that session. Sir's books are available at the bookstore if anybody wants to buy some. And we're just going to take a short break till we come back.